So just a little bit about myself. I'm um, trained wildlife biologist. I've worked for ODF&W for, gosh, 23 years now, but have been working as a wildlife biologist for almost 30. Um, my current job with ODF&W is a regional wildlife conservation biologist, and I'm stationed up in our Clackamas office. My territory is all of Northwest Oregon, from the coast to the crest of the west of the Cascades, and all of Willamette Valley. So I understand that many of you are within the Willamette Valley ecoregion, but some of you also are in the West Cascades ecoregion. So some of the information I'm going to be talking about tonight might apply to you folks that are more in the valley, and other aspects of wildlife habitat might be more pertinent for those of you who are in the West Cascades ecoregion, where it's more forested, conifer forest, that is. We have plenty of forest in the Willamette Valley, but just different habitat types, right? So just a quick overview of what I'll be talking about. What I want to cover tonight is, first of all, what is wildlife habitat? Want to make sure we're on the same page, because it's really not as simple as you might think, or as I think. Why it's important. It's always good to ask the question, why even should we care about providing wildlife habitat? What's the big deal? And then I want to focus on the components, the four main components of habitat. And then I'll talk about what are called microhabitat features or microhabitat elements. I don't know if any of you have heard that phrase before, but I'll introduce you to that if you haven't. And then I'll focus in on some species-specific examples. I'm kind of deviating from the agenda that Sarah sent me. You'll probably pick that out if I don't have anything specific on beavers tonight, for example. I don't have anything dedicated toward climate resiliency, but I'll pop a few things in there that are related to beavers and climate. It's because it's all connected, right? And then finally, I'll talk just very briefly about some basic concepts when you start to move forward with your conservation planning, how to work wildlife habitat into that plan, if you choose to, which I hope you do. Okay, so what is wildlife habitat? Well, it really depends on the critter in order to define what habitat is, because every critter, every different species of wildlife has and uses different types of habitat. They have different requirements. So for example, here in the slide, I've pulled out 4 species. Black-tailed deer are what we would call habitat generalists. They use a variety of different types of habitats to meet their life requisites. Whereas Western meadowlark, the singing bird, our state bird, uses different types of habitat. So habitat for a black-tailed deer, for example, is not habitat for meadowlarks. Habitat for meadowlarks would be big expanses of grassland type of habitat with singing perches and forbs, and safety from predators. But from the Western painted turtle perspective, the critter on the lower left, habitat for a painted turtle, for example, is very different than a deer and a meadowlark. Painted turtles need both aquatic and terrestrial habitats. They need to be in the water to swallow their food, but they need upland habitats near water for egg laying. And then some species, such as the critters on the lower right, which are ensitinas. Ensitinas are one of our native salamanders. They're terrestrial salamanders, and they spend their entire life on land. They're very cryptic. You might not even see them, but they have totally different habitat requirements, right? So they don't need water like turtles need water, but they need moist hiding places in the ground, under deep leaf litter, logs, woody debris, that sort of thing. So wildlife habitat is highly variable because each species has its particular needs and life history requirements, its habits, its behavior. So these are just some things to think about when you're some pretty broad concepts when it comes to habitat. Is it's very species specific. That said, wildlife habitat in general always provides for key components. So whatever the critter, whatever their habitat requirements or habitat types that they're using, they all need food, they all need water in some form, they all need cover, and they all need space. So, food, that's kind of an obvious one, but different critters eat different types of food. That could be leaves, berries, nuts, fungi, other species of wildlife that feed on those plant and insect materials. Water, some species of wildlife need to drink what we call free water. So water in a wetland, a pond, a stream, that would be free water. Whereas other species obtain most of their water from the food items that they're eating. But water is important for all species, however form they need to take it into their bodies. Cover, all wildlife need some sort of cover. So cover means nesting habitat, breeding habitat, places to hide from predators, to rest, to sleep. Wildlife do sleep. They rest, they need shelter from weather conditions that are not conducive to them. And then cover also is needed for overwintering. And then space is kind of a weird concept, but basically what space is getting at is it's the area that the wildlife, the species needs to survive and eke out its living on the landscape. And it is related to a species home range and territory, which again is highly variable. That little Ensatina terrestrial salamander doesn't move, doesn't have a very large home range, isn't moving the miles that a deer or even a Western painted turtle is capable of moving. But space also is related to the ability of that critter to move safely across the landscape to access the food, the water, the cover in the different forms it takes through the seasons to meet all of its life cycle requirements. And again, that looks different for every species, but habitat in general, when you're thinking, okay, what do I need to provide habitat? You want to be thinking, okay, food, water, cover, space. How do I provide these things for species in general? But then also, there are species of particular concern that, and I'll talk more about that here in a little bit. But again, generally, some big concepts would be if you provide a diversity of habitats that are complex, diverse, in your area, on your land, you're going to provide, or that diverse habitat is going to provide and support the greatest diversity of wildlife species, like the greatest number of species, but also the variety of species. So you might not be able to, for example, provide for a habitat specialist like the Western meadowlark on your property, unless you can, provide those big expanses of grassland. But if you provide a variety of complex habitats that's going to be great for a variety of wildlife species. So, but before we jump into looking at some of these components more closely, let's talk about why what we're creating the habitat for, right? Why wildlife habitat? Well, it is about the wildlife, and healthy populations of wildlife are dependent on the presence of healthy habitats, healthy, diverse habitats, whether it's a forest, a grassland, a wetland, or whatnot. Healthy habitats equals healthy wildlife populations, numbers, and diversity. And in terms of climate resiliency, but also species resiliency, again, it's all about diversity. Kind of like our human diet. Like, we need a variety of foods to nourish our bodies. It's the same thing with habitats and species on the landscape. So we all are probably familiar with some of the species that maybe are on the screen here, but we have a variety of wildlife in Oregon. Some of the species have ranges that cover the entire state. Others are specific to certain ecoregions or habitat or certain areas within the state. But we have a variety of birds, amphibians, reptiles, mammals. And just as a clarification, I'm not going to be talking about fish, and I'm not going to be talking about insects or pollinators specifically, except as their importance as food items for so many of these species. So many species of wildlife rely on insects, invertebrates for food during some part of their life cycle. So wildlife includes game species and non-game. So game, those species that you would be able to harvest, as well as the non-game, those that are not traditionally hunted or that currently aren't regulated in that manner. And of all the fish and wildlife species in Oregon, 85% of those fall into that non-game category. So non-game species, and that's actually my area of focus, just to let you know. I didn't define my position very well. My focus in ODFW is non-game species, in particular those that are on our state sensitive species list, and those that are in the Oregon Conservation Strategy and designated as species of greatest conservation need. So these are the species that are of highest conservation concern because of the declines in their numbers and the declines in the habitat in which they depend on. We care about all native species. They're all very important for a variety of reasons. Whether you're a hunter or not, there's so many reasons to value wildlife, and but there is a subset of species, these species of greatest conservation need, which we're in particular concerned about because of their declining population trends. And some of those are already listed, but the goal is to prevent them from not being listed. It's a lot better to do preventative medicine, so to speak, and that's where these types of workshops are really important, because it really starts with educating, like all landowners. There's something that everyone can do to help. You might not be able to help every species of concern in your area of influence, but there's something that someone can do. There's something that everyone can do something. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So just a closer look at these species of greatest conservation need. And again, these are described in more detail. I'm not going to talk about them all, obviously, in the conservation strategy, the Oregon Conservation Strategy. If you're not familiar with, I highly encourage you to check out the conservation strategy. It's on ODFW's website. It's our state wildlife action plan, which all 50 states plus have what's called a state wildlife action plan, which basically provides the framework for the states to manage, conserve fish and wildlife, or priority habitats, not just for fish and wildlife. They're also in Oregon's state wildlife action plan. We also have plants, algae, and invertebrates included. So, but the intent is to highlight those species, what they need, what their threats are, and provide recommended conservation actions to address the needs of those species and the habitats that they're so dependent on. So I encourage you to check it out. It's a great resource. Oh, so this slide just highlights, I just wanted to highlight for those of you who are in the Willamette Valley acreage, and I just pulled out a handful of strategy species. There's 67 species in total. Again, this is wildlife, or fish, reptiles, amphibians, birds, plants, and invertebrates. But so if you have some of these species on your property currently, to me, that is a big deal, because these are at-risk species and ones that we're particularly interested in maintaining on the landscape. And then if you're in the West Cascades, I pulled out a few to highlight for your area too. Some of these species, as you might notice, are more associated with mature late successional conifer forests, like the goshawk and hoary bat. But then also we have some like more headwater stream associates, like the coastal tailed frog. And then we only have here in Oregon 2 species of native turtles, and their priorities wherever they exist because they're rare. Moving on. So why are these species on decline? Many reasons, many complicated reasons, but the number one reason that all wildlife are on the decline is habitat loss. And habitat loss has resulted from many different activities: urban development, changes in land use, agriculture, energy development. The list is long, we all know it, but the bottom line is that wildlife are on the decline, or the main threat to wildlife in general is habitat loss, that's already occurred, but also the continued pressures, because habitat, yes, there's a lot of good things going on to create and restore habitat, but we're still losing habitat, quality habitat that provides for the necessary life functions for a lot of the species, in particular this habitat specialists. So not all species are on the decline, but many are. And just one example, it's estimated in terms of not just like rare species declines, it's been estimated that over the past 40 years that we've lost about 50% of even our common bird species, just due to changes like lost habitat through conversion, but also through degradation from invasive plants and animals, disease, hazards on the landscape. All these things have this cumulative effect, that habitat is the number one reason. So whatever we can do to protect habitat where it still exists is a priority. Whatever we can do to restore habitat is encouraged. And there are lots of tools to help. Okay, so just bringing it home a little closer. This slide shows just the habitat loss that's occurred in one of our habitat types, Oregon white oak. And it sounds like some of you might have Oregon white oak on your land, and that's great. I'm excited to hear that. It is, and you probably know this, but it is rare and it's special, and we have very little of it left in the Willamette Valley ecoregion in particular. And now it depends on where you are, but you can, this on the left was the historic, meaning the pre-European settlement. All this yellow, orange is where Oregon white oak used to occur. And in comparison, the image on the right side is remnant. So very little. So where it's remains, it's a priority from a wildlife perspective to retain, because it's really hard to replace. It's slow growing, and it takes time to replace. And why is this habitat type of particular interest? With this Oregon white oak actually is highlighted. You can get a lot more information on it. And there's lots of information on Oregon white oak habitat and restoration techniques. There were some questions about that, or a question earlier about plant species, for example, but there's some great resources. I think I plopped at least one into the materials website or folder, and I can put some more in there. You can find them online, but the Oregon white oak habitat is what's called a strategy habitat or priority habitat in the conservation strategy. So again, check out the strategy and you can find resources there, because it's important because of how many species depend on it. So once that habitat is gone, those species that depend on it have a hard time surviving, and therefore that's the reason we're seeing declines in a lot of these species. These species here, the white slender-billed or white-breasted slender-billed nuthatch, acorn woodpeckers, chipping sparrows, even western gray squirrels. I know they can be annoying for some folks, especially if you're trying to grow some hazelnuts, but actually these are just 4 of many species that depend on Oregon white oak habitat, and that we're concerned about because of declines in their populations, which again is linked to the habitat. So let's focus in on what to do. That's kind of like, hopefully puts it into a little perspective, like this is serious. We're losing habitat. These species are struggling. Okay, what can we do about it? What's recommended? And again, getting back to the 4 components: food, water, cover, space. Let's start with food. The key message related to food is it's all about the native plants. Native vegetation provides 10 to 15 times more food than non-native plant species. And again, food could mean the nectar, the flowers, seeds, berries, leaves, twigs. But native vegetation is provides so much more value to wildlife in terms of food production than non-native plants. So whatever you can do on your land, in your space, however small or large, to provide native plants, and often that means battling the non-natives. I mean, it's a battle. It's like doing laundry, dishes. It's a never-ending battle. But replace the non-natives with the native plants, and the native plants provide huge benefit to and support for native insects. And from a wildlife perspective, insects make the world go round. I know they make the world go round in so many other aspects too, for food production, pollination services, but insects are important food items for many, many wildlife species, directly or indirectly. And just one example of how important insects are to wildlife is looking at birds. Like there are some species of birds that need insects through every stage of their life cycle, but a lot of them eat seeds and other things when they're adults. But those species of birds that shift, that eat seeds and other things as an adults, they're all feeding their young these little tiny packages of protein in the form of insects. And it's been estimated that 96% of terrestrial birds rely on insects during some part, and a lot of that is related to those insects being food items for the nestlings, the young that they're rearing, which then turn out to be eating other things. But again, the insects are they're high protein sources and important for those growing birds. And in terms of food, diversity is key. So that's the benefit of native plants, is they're adapted to our climate and a site, and they naturally produce food throughout the year at different times of the year. So there's always something for the wildlife that depend on those plants to eat. So diversity of species is key in your space. And then there are other habitat elements that provide important food, or are hosts for food. Snags and logs. So snags, dead and dying trees, down logs. Those are places where a lot of wildlife will find their food also, because those snags and logs are being decomposed by insects, which then in turn are food for birds, bears, reptiles, amphibians. So again, it all starts with native plants, and diversity is key. And just a side note here, and sometimes I'll get asked about supplemental feeding, and from a wildlife conservation perspective, supplemental feeding of wildlife is not necessary. And if you have healthy habitats that are providing a variety of foods, or these foods seasonally all through the year, that's adequate. Wildlife are adapted to these native plants and are obtaining their food that way. So supplemental feeding of wildlife, artificial feeding, is not necessary, and it's discouraged for a variety of reasons. Wildlife health reasons are a huge reason, but also whenever you introduce an artificial food source, it usually ends up badly for both the human and the wildlife. So I'm all about avoiding conflict. So enough about that. So water. So water is essential, I already mentioned, for wildlife survival. While water quality and quantity is identified in the conservation strategy as a key conservation issue, meaning it's something that is a problem and of concern. Water, we have, just as the previous presenter showed, we have in one of the slides, we have water, we have streams that are water quality limited, listed because of pollution concerns, whether it be from sediment or pollutants. We have, again, related to the habitat loss, we have, it's estimated that 40% of all of Oregon's wetlands have been diked and drained, compared to historical amounts of wetlands that used to be on the landscape. And wetlands are still being filled, and mitigated wetlands don't function the way natural wetlands do. There's just no way to recreate a wetland once it's lost. We try, but it's not the same. All that to say is that water is essential, and it's something that we can provide in our spaces for wildlife. And it's important to think about how water is used differently by different species. So for example, as I mentioned, some critters need to drink water, and that's really important, and particularly during the hot, droughty periods, but also during the freezing cold snaps that we occasionally get. Sources of clean water are extra important during those time frames. But some species actually need water for reproduction. We have species of amphibians that need clean water at the right time of the year for egg laying. We need water that turtles can live in and that's clean and persists. So water is important for a variety of species in different ways. So some examples or some suggestions would be to prevent or to protect water quality, restore wetlands where you have them on your land, and riparian buffers in particular along wetlands and waterways are really important for helping to clean the water. You already heard about the importance of buffers, filter strips, but it's the same idea. These plants filter, clean the water, and that is a way to improve wildlife habitat. Just a note about beaver, American beaver. We have mountain beaver and there's American beaver, but beaver are really great at creating wetlands and through their damming activities, but also promoting or cleaning water. So through beaver activity, for example, water is filtered, it's cleaned, it's cooled. So if you have the opportunity to promote beaver on your land, that's encouraged, because that's a great way to provide habitat, water in particular, for a variety of species that are going to benefit. So cover, another important component of wildlife habitat. And this cover, when thinking about how to provide cover, again, these are kind of general concepts, and it does help to think about the specific critter, but in general, you want to think in layers from the ground up, and remember that some species are living low in the ground in the leaf litter. So the leaf litter is cover, and the shrub layer is cover. The young trees are cover, the older trees are cover. So it's all those layers of habitat and native plants that you're providing and is providing cover for and nesting places, roosting, hiding, all that are forms of cover for species. And again, diversity is key in species structure. So different species of plants, but also conifers and deciduous are great to have and provide diversity and host different insects. And then another key component of diversity are these micro habitat elements, these snags and these logs, which we're gonna talk a little more about here now. So snags, dead and dying trees, stumps, which is basically a short snag. A stub is another word for a taller stump in between a stump. But basically, all dead and dying trees, regardless of the height, the diameter, have value on the landscape for wildlife. They're extremely important habitat elements that benefit many different species of wildlife. And they're one of the most limited habitat elements on the landscape, meaning we don't have enough of them. We don't have as many as we used to. We don't have enough of them, or we don't have them in the places where we need them, for example. So I just wanted to talk about how to provide some snags and stumps. And so here are a couple of examples. The picture on the right actually is of a stub. It was a created snag. Here at the ODFW complex, we have some historical buildings, and this tree it was considered a hazard to one of our historical buildings. But instead of removing it, we had the tree service provider cut it, I think maybe 20, 25 feet up. And so we reduced the hazard to the buildings. Also, you might be able to see there's a road back here behind. So this is a road. So it was a real hazard. But we eliminated the hazard, but retained as much of the tree, and it's in the process of dying. And you might be able to see there's a couple cavities over here. We put this nice, cute little sign on it that you can't read. But the point is that that's wildlife habitat. And if you have the opportunity to create snags, please do, because they're very valuable. If you need to address a hazard, that's totally reasonable. But perhaps instead of taking the entire tree down, grinding up the stump, you could leave a third of it, and you would address the hazard, but retain some value to habitat for wildlife. This is an extreme way to provide snags and in the future, and dying, well, snags and logs actually. But this is actually one method of I like to call it the Insta-Snag method. This is a large floodplain restoration site up in Multnomah County near the Columbia River. And there wasn't anything to work with. So these trees were, I can't remember where they came from. I think they were removed as part of another project development. They were stored for a while, and then as part of this restoration project, they were brought in, and holes were augured in the ground, and the trees were flipped up and inserted, and the soil and rock tamped down. So these are kind of strange looking, but these are snags, and actually they have already been used by birds. We've seen birds. There's monitoring going on, and but as this restoration site, you can see hasn't even been planted yet. But as this restoration site matures, those snags will increase in value as the native vegetation grows up and the restored floodplain does its thing. So I'm throwing this out here as, if you don't have a tree to work with, you can actually bring one in and create your own snag. And it provides value. Even one. It doesn't have to be this many. Even one. Okay, so other microhabitat elements are to think about incorporating into your conservation plan would be logs. So these would be trees that have fallen, obviously, but are providing habitat benefit. So instead of cutting them up or burning them or whatever, just leaving them on the ground. These logs are extremely important. They provide spots for denning animals. They're foraging areas, their perches, so many benefits as they decay and create and add to the soil. Rock piles, another valuable type of habitat, which both logs, if you don't have any existing, they can be brought in, they can be installed, and actually all three of these pictures, this log was placed, these rock piles were constructed. This is a large rock pile actually on that same floodplain restoration project with the Snags that I in the last slide. This rock pile was designed specifically for mink. So these rock piles they provide lots of nooks and crannies and moist spots for small mammals, reptiles, amphibians, even birds will use them as hiding cover, foraging. We have birds that nest in low to the ground, and they use logs and rocks. Here's another example of a restoration project that I was involved in. This actually was on a wetland creation restoration project on a working forest up in Clackamas County. And as part of the wetland enhancement work, or the creation project part of it, we brought in, or the contractor brought in pieces of wood with the root wad still attached, very valuable. And also placed wood up in the upland areas. You can't see it, but there's large wood that was brought in and placed in the uplands. Here's one big rock. There were also rock piles created in the upland areas, placed in both sunny areas and shady areas. So reptiles and amphibians are ectotherms, and they really need to regulate their they have specific temperature regulation needs, and these rock piles and logs help provide them with hiding places to keep moist. The rocks stay warm, and reptiles like snakes and lizards will bask on them. They're places where insects can be found and foraged on. Actually, last time I was out at the site, there was a mammal burrow under this rock, which was pretty cool. And actually, just a few weeks after putting this root wad in, just as a side note, there were like 15 red-legged frog egg masses attached to those root stringers. So that diversity, the complexity of that root wad was highly valuable, more so than this single tree that was put in, single log. Still valuable, but the root wad was more complex, and more suitable, provided those egg mass attachment sites. Habitat piles, another habitat element, extremely important. And in the scheme of things, they're really easy to provide. I have several of these in my own small backyard, and they are used. Basically, it's just layers of logs, sticks. I use sticks, branches that come down during the windstorms. I just throw in a pile, and that is my wildlife habitat pile. It kind of drives my husband crazy, but because it is messy. And so this sort of requires a paradigm shift, like to move away from neat and clean and tidy to messy. I'm going to lead the leads. So because wildlife, again, it gets down to that diversity, the complexity. Messy is better, provides those nooks and crannies and little micro habitat features that critters need and depend on, and which generally are lacking in many places. Here's an example of, it happens to be another floodplain restoration project in Washington County. And the wetlands, and this is a floodplain. There are wetlands, but you can't see them on this particular photo. But here you can see habitat piles have been created in the floodplain, and basically what these structures do is they provide stepping stones for wildlife to move safely across the landscape from one habitat type to another. So from the wetland, for example, or the riparian area to the forested area, because again, a lot of species they're moving, they're using different types of habitat types. They're just not staying in one place. Some stay in one place, like and or move maybe just between the two piles, for example. But these habitat piles are great ways to provide for 3, if not 4, of the key habitat elements that critters need to survive. They retain moisture, and they're just really important. I can't emphasize that enough. And in terms of how many per acre, even 1 is valuable, but ideally you'd have like 4 to 8 per acre, spaced about 100 to 150 feet apart. Again, the idea is to provide cover, places for smaller animals in particular to move safely across the landscape. And these should not be burned. Just FYI, these are not burn piles. They are habitat piles, so they're meant to persist on the landscape. That said, if a particular pile needed to be moved for some reason, that's not unreasonable, but the goal is to allow them to persist for the benefit of the critters. Okay, space. How am I doing on time? Okay. So again, the concept here is providing suitable habitat allows wildlife to safely move, safely move across the landscape between the habitat types that they're using during different types of the year, whether it's from breeding habitat to non-breeding habitat or summer habitat to winter. Again, it kind of depends on the species, but one of the main ways to provide space or safe movement passages is to provide riparian buffers, to restore riparian buffers. So restoring native vegetation along waterways, wetlands, planting native species to connect patches of habitat that otherwise might make it difficult for certain species of wildlife to move safely from one patch to the other. This type of vegetated cover makes it a lot easier than for a critter to move than what you see here on the right. And again, micro habitat elements are great tools to achieve this goal of providing safe movement across the landscape. And another thing to think about is where to provide habitat such that it's away from regular human disturbance. And some species of wildlife are more tolerant than others. Some are very secretive and less tolerant of human presence, activities, noise, light. So when thinking about where you want to manage for wildlife habitat, something to consider is trying to provide habitat away from places of high human activity, places of high road activity, other sorts of disturbances that might set up the critter for reproductive failure or mortality, too much disturbance, which would then cause it to move away. Another thing to think about is barriers to wildlife movement, not just the lack of cover habitat, for example, but physical barriers, whether it's a road, impassable culverts, not just from the fish perspective, but there are wildlife that pass through culverts, and sometimes those are impassable. But fences are something to really consider. I know they're needed in a lot of livestock operations, but they also can create conflicts for wildlife. So whatever you can do, we advise using wildlife-friendly designs, allowing space under the bottom wire for animals to pass safely under, and then minimizing strands and barbed wire to prevent animals such as this great horned owl from getting tangled up and ultimately dying. So let's look, we're going to shift here and look at a few species groups in particular, and I pulled out some of the priority species groups, just like those species that are associated with Oregon white oak. Grassland birds in particular are species of greatest conservation need. Grasslands are even more rare in the Willamette Valley ecoregion than Oregon white oak. It's estimated that we've lost up to about 98% of all of our native, and I'm talking native grassland. And as mentioned previously, it's really hard to recreate native grassland with native plant species. And it can be done, but it's very expensive, and there are many challenges to it. And in the grassland restoration, prairie restoration world, depending on who you ask, one of the conclusions is that structure of the grass, of the non-native grass, is probably going to be what we can do in reality now. It's probably not feasible. It isn't feasible to restore native prairies every place they used to, for a variety of reasons. But a priority would be to provide the native forbs and flowers in the grasslands that do remain, or that you want to manage for grasslands. So you could manage, what I'm trying to say is the vegetation structure of the grasses in particular seems to be more important than the actual grass species. So it's kind of a trade-off. If you had to pick one, native grass versus the forbs and flowers, go with the forbs and flowers, because again, it's the forbs and flowers that are attracting the pollinators, and the pollinators are what those grassland birds need to feed their young. So grassland birds are in trouble because of the grassland habitat loss, and the amount, but also it's been fragmented, and a lot of our grassland species need large patches. They also need patches of bare ground, or those grassland areas need areas of bare ground to provide the structure and spots for those birds to build their nests. And then singing perches are also important to grassland bird species. So when thinking about how to restore habitat, grassland habitat for grassland birds, the recommendation is to plant some native bunch grasses, like the tufted hairgrass is a good one because it grows well in comparison to some of those other native grasses, but to really focus on increasing the forbs and managing the non-native grasses in a way that mimics the structure of a native grassland. And that's done basically by your regime of mowing and hanging and grazing. Prescribed burning is ideal. I know that there are many challenges to that, growing challenges, but it's still being done. Prescribed burning is still an option. There's a lot more information on this, and a lot of resources in terms of prairie restoration, grassland restoration, and I encourage you to check out ODFW's publication. There's a picture of the cover here on the slide, and that's available on our website. I think I put it in the materials folder, but there are other resources on the topic. And grassland, if you can incorporate grassland habitat into your land, that is a priority from a wildlife conservation perspective, because of how much habitat we've already lost and how many species depend on that habitat type. So bats are another group of conservation concern. Bats don't get a lot of love. I mean, some people love them and some people hate them. There's a lot of misinformation about bats, but bats are very important consumers and producers. Consumers of insects, all of Oregon's bats, and we have 15 species in Oregon, 12 in Western Oregon, 12 different species. They all consume insects, highly dependent on a variety of insects, from moths to beetles to mosquitoes, you name it. They're after it, and they need a lot of those insects are associated with water, so clean water is important. They also rely heavily on roosts. I mean, they need roosts, and roosts are just places to hang out during the night, places to hang out during the day. Then there are different roost sites for winter hibernacula, and then there are maternity roosts, the places where female bats congregate and give birth to their pups. So bottom line is bats need a variety of different places to safe places to hang out and rest and eat their food and raise their young. And a lot of our bats are associated with forests, but others are also strongly associated with, well, they're all strongly associated with wetlands, water, fresh water, and insects. Some of them are associated with conifer forests, but others are also deciduous, mixed deciduous forests. So again, providing a diversity of plants. Large trees are ideal or important because it's the large trees, certain species in particular, like cottonwood, Oregon white oak, Doug fir, which in immature form has the deep grooves in the bark and provides lots of nooks and crannies for bats to be roosting in. And then also logs and snags are important. Bats will roost in stumps, in logs, on the ground. They're not always up on high. They're not always high up somewhere needing to swoop down. They are totally capable and they will roost low to the ground. So some recommended actions would be to, again, provide the diversity of native plants, because it's about the insects, particularly for the bats. Protect wetlands and water quality, which is important habitat for those insects, but also because bats actually during the hot droughty periods, they can't get enough water from their insect prey. They drink water. That's why sometimes bats are found on the ground during the summer, is they're drinking water. They actually will swoop, fly over wetlands, not swoop, they'll fly over wetlands and drink water. It's pretty cool. And then as you're retaining or creating your dead and dying trees, a bat box is always a good option. It's an artificial option, but it's a necessary option because, again, these snags, we've removed so many of them already. Bat boxes mimic bat natural habitat. All right. Turtles. So I've already mentioned Oregon has 2 species of native turtles, Western Pond and Western Painted, both of which are in are throughout Marion County. Both species are. They require, like I mentioned before, both aquatic habitat for part of their life needs, but they also need terrestrial habitat. So they'll eat in the water, they'll bask on logs in the water or rocks in the water, but they need land for laying eggs. They quite a few pond turtles actually spend hot, droughty periods on land in dense shrubs. Pond turtles will leave the water and spend the summer on land, and pond turtles also tend to winter on land. And some of their favorite wintering spots are forests, shrubby, with lots of dense shrubby understory. They'll overwinter near stumps and logs because of the warmth of that decaying wood helps them regulate their temperature. So it's important to have these both terrestrial habitats and aquatic habitats in close proximity, because they need to move between them without becoming food for a predator, or often now it's being run over by a car because the road separates the aquatic habitat from the nesting habitat, for example. So some recommended habitat enhancement techniques for turtles specifically would be to add basking structures. And again, this is just similar to providing a log on the ground. You're just providing it in the water, and little turtles need little basking structures and big turtles need bigger basking structures. And the more the better. And placement is key also. So if you're wanting to attract and benefit turtles, putting the basking structure in a sunny spot is really important. They will use basking structure in the shade, but they prefer and need sun. So putting the basking structures in sunny spots is recommended. And then other habitat enhancements to help turtles would be creating the nesting habitat. Nesting habitat is considered the most limiting habitat feature needed by our native turtles. And there's a lot more to turtles, and I encourage you to check out ODFNW's guidance document on conserving turtles, and there's a chapter on creating habitat. It goes through each one of those habitat elements, how to provide aquatic habitat, how to provide nesting, how many basking structures, that sort of thing. All right, amphibians. So amphibians are very sensitive to habitat loss and are globally, regionally on the decline. This frog species here on the slide is the northern red-legged frog. It's on our state sensitive species list and conservation strategy. species as well, and actually a federal species of concern also. Red-legged frogs need aquatic habitat for egg laying. The top photo shows an egg mass. So one egg mass equals one female frog, and each female frog lays one egg mass per year, and it needs to be attached to a sturdy stem. It could be woody, or it could be a sturdy grassy or emergent plant stem. But they also, frogs, once the frogs are done breeding, mating, laying eggs in the water, those frogs are in the uplands. They might hang out for a little while near the water's edge. Usually it's a male waiting to see if another female will show up, but they don't stick around the water for very long. Once they lay their egg mass, they're out of there. And they're up in the uplands, and they need moist hiding places with deep leaf litter, shrubby cover, ferns, logs, stumps. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but they need habitat up in the uplands where they are then looking for insects, invertebrates to be eating, foraging, growing, and then hiding cover to hide from predators. So some things that can be done to improve habitat for red-legged frogs and other stillwater breeding amphibians like northwestern salamanders, long-toed salamanders, Pacific tree frogs, rough-skinned newts, would be to protect and maintain known breeding sites, because breeding sites provide specific habitat needs. And if the species is there, if you know the species is there using it, the recommendation is to protect it and maintain it. And then enhance it. Maybe there's some things that you can do to enhance it. Actually, you can provide more egg mass attachment sites. This egg mass right here in the top photo is actually on a stick that I put in a pond, and within a week, that egg mass had been attached to that stick. So sometimes they're just simple things that we can do to provide more habitat for species so they find what they need. And they will come back, because amphibians have very strong migratory patterns. They have site fidelity, so the same frogs return to the same site year after year after year. I mean, we know there's dispersal going on, but we also know that the same animal will come back to its natal spot and use the same habitat if it's there and if it's still suitable. So maintaining quality habitat, key. Improving it. Providing sun. Sometimes in my world anyway, I am involved in a lot of riparian restoration projects, and I've talked about riparian restoration in this presentation, and revegetating streams and waterways is important for cooling water to meet water quality criteria, but there are species that need sun on the water, and amphibians are one of those. So because it's the sun, the warmth from the sun that makes those eggs grow. And again, one of the main ones besides protecting the breeding sites would be to provide the habitat connectivity, the stepping stones that if it's not a fully vegetated swath from the breeding pond to the foraging pond or foraging area in the uplands, providing stepping stones in the form of logs and habitat piles and rock piles are things that can be pretty easily incorporated onto the landscape that have great benefits to these species. So I'm close to wrapping up here. I just wanted to talk I just have one slide on just some very basic concepts when you're thinking about, and maybe you probably already thought about this, how to incorporate wildlife habitat into your overall land management plan. The first step is to inventory what you have. And in this case, it's what type of habitats do you have? But that relates to soil and the site conditions like slope and aspect. But what kind of habitat types do you have? What kind of plants do you have now? What kind of features do you have? Like, do you have snags? If you have a snag, if you have logs, those are things that you in your planning effort want to make sure you retain and protect and build on. But you also want to identify, and this applies to your planning process in general, other things on the landscape that might affect where it's reasonable or where you're willing to create enhanced habitat, like where your structures are, your roads, your utilities, other constraints that you have on your landscape and need to work around based on your priorities. Making a list of species that you've seen, if you're not already, if you haven't already started a species list for your property, I encourage you to, because often what you see is indicative of, will help inform you anyway. It's indicative of your habitat types, but will also inform you of current quality and maybe what you can build upon also. So make a list of species present that you've seen, and then based on the habitat types, what you would expect to be there within the confines of, are you in that species range? Like some species are, for example, are just found in Southern Oregon, so it wouldn't make sense for you to try to provide habitat for them because they're never gonna get there, right? They just don't occur in this area, for example. So then looking at your existing habitat functions or existing habitat types, it helps to kind of look through the lens of knowing what different species need to survive, reproduce, and thrive. How is that habitat in its current state functioning? And that could be, you might, well, that gets into like the size of the patch, the prevalence of invasive plant species, for example, maybe the lack of some of those habitat elements. Maybe you have a wetland, but it's not the right depth that red-legged frogs need, for example, or that turtles need. So you want to think about, okay, how is my current habitat functioning based on what the species needs? And then identify your habitat goals and actions based on, and it could be based on habitat, but it helps to have a species lens again. And most people I work with they want to provide habitat in general, but they have a few species in mind that they're interested in, whether it's waterfowl because they're waterfowl hunters, or they're really into birds and they want to increase their bird diversity because they want to watch them and listen to them. And so again, it depends on your goals, but it's helpful from my perspective to really think about it in terms of what a particular species or group of species needs to survive, and then see what actions based on current conditions and then your desired future conditions, what actions need to be taken to reach your desired future condition. And then some things to think about are how to implement those actions without doing unintended negative harm impacts to the critters that you're trying to help. So for example, maybe you want to and need to, it would be helpful to graze a certain area or change up your rotation in a certain area, but the timing of that could be really important to the species that you're trying to manage for. So just to keep those things in mind. And then monitor and adapt, monitor and adapt are key components of any plan. It's good to have a plan, but plans change because we learn. Okay, so key takeaways. Habitat is important. A lot of Oregon's wildlife are on the decline, and the main reason is because of wildlife habitat loss or habitat loss. So anything small or large that you could do can have a real significant helpful impact on wildlife species. And diversity is key, a variety of native vegetation, because it starts with the plants. It starts with the plants and then the insects. The insects are the food for so many critters. Keep battling those invasives, plants and animals. Animals can be a little trickier, but animals, nutria, degrade, water quality, impact native vegetation, compete. There's more I could say about that, but invasive plants and animals are something that we have and we have to deal with, but we can keep chipping away at them. Provide clean water, provide safe space. Again, those key habitat, those micro habitat elements are key. I highly encourage you to think about and protect the ones that you have, and then provide what you can on your landscape to provide those important stepping stones for safe movement of wildlife from one habitat patch to another. And then when you're planning, start with an inventory and strategize, implement your plan, monitor, and bottom line is enjoy what you have that use your property. See what comes to your property. You will be, you'll benefit from it. It's, as you already know, I'm sure many of you know, like, and you live on the land for a reason. These species are beautiful, whether you're hunters or anglers or just bird watchers or listeners. These species are so important for healthy, diverse, and resilient systems. And there's something that we can do to help them, each one of us.